Hello and welcome back to another episode of Solipsis Rants and Raves, or whatever this show is called. I say that every episode. I should just actually settle on a better name. So on my mind, as you can see in the title, right at the current moment, Marvel Rivals is very popular, and I have dabbled in it briefly myself. It's not my favorite thing, but it's got some good stuff going for it. But it's gotten me thinking about something that's sort of been on my mind more in general for a while now, and that I thought warranted making a video just to sort of like eject some of the thoughts that I've had. And primarily that's about people not understanding what the game is. And this is something that goes back a long ways. It's not something that's new or unique to Marvel Rivals, but Marvel Rivals, I think, more than anything in recent memory, even other recent popular games, exemplifies an issue. I hesitate to say issue, but certainly a development in gaming spaces and the people who play games and the type of games that are made that I think is at least curious and worth exploring. And primarily that's about role-based games. Now, I'm going to try and keep the scope of this video kind of limited because it is a Rants and Raves, not a DTF. So I'm not going to make this a 45-minute video. But this goes back all the way to things like early role-playing games, and we could start talking about tabletop RPGs, D&D, the way that D&D and the resurgence of D&D and the differences between like advanced D&D versus what 5th edition looks like now, how all of these things also have started to reflect a similar trend towards less role-based play and some development of that may or may not be good because as a result. But I'm going to try and keep it focused on Marvel Rivals and a few other games. Mostly this came about in particular because I noticed that people are pretty good at the basics of the game. They're good at aiming, shooting, getting people down, that sort of thing. What they're terrible at is tactics. And this is something that I have seen in so many other multiplayer games that I've played over time, whether it's traditional MMORPGs, it's other shooters, it's other FPSs, other hero shooters, whether that's I think Overwatch is of course on the tip of everyone's tongue when talking about Marvel Rivals, as Rivals is really very much the replacement hero shooter for a lot of people who are sort of wanting or have been wanting or have gotten away from Overwatch. But this also dips into things like MOBAs and the way that the prevalence of MOBAs over the last 15 years in particular has really influenced the gaming market in general in a variety of ways, and how it's also instigated the decline of, to my view, a couple of other genres, in particular the single player like hardcore RPG it's not a dead genre, but it has been waning for some time and losing popularity. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. First and foremost, I think this is in part because there has been a trend for some time now, growing at an accelerating rate over the last 10 years, I would say, towards a lot of free-to-play games that are reliant on internal monetization, but have a very low barrier to entry, and may be, in many cases, people's first experience with serious gaming, whether it's because they just didn't have the means prior to that, or the sheer accessibility because it's multi-platform or something like that, or they're literally children, because Lord knows there are a lot of children who played Overwatch 2 and now Rivals, because it is free as long as you have a computer that can run it, which is an interesting point for Rivals, sidebar, just because Rivals runs pretty heavy on almost everybody's machine. But as long as you had a machine that could run it, that was sort of, that meant it was very accessible and very targeted, not only in its marketing, but in that accessibility towards a younger audience with limited means, at least limited means to buy something up front. I'm going to try not to digress too much into this, but I need to get into it for a second. This has gotten into something I've talked about for a long time, and you can look at some of my previous videos about it, not necessarily in this series, but there's been this trend overall for these free-to-play games to be very normalized, if not sort of overtaking the industry in general, especially over the last few years, because it is a much better monetization scheme psychologically for the developers, because the barrier to entry is basically zero. As long as you have an internet connection and a machine that can run it, you can get it. But once you're already into the ecosystem, they already have their hooks in you. You have an emotional attachment, want to continue playing the game. And so the barriers to wanting to start to spend money, whether it's on cosmetics or advancement or these other things, this has been a trend throughout the gaming industry that I think has been largely negative. It hasn't resulted in just garbage games, but it has caused other issues as a result. All right, digression aside, what's particularly pertinent about all this towards this particular issue that I'm seeing is I think there are a lot of people playing these games, whether it's Overwatch 2, whether it's Fortnite, whether even Fortnite counts in this case, even though it's not really an RPG in any serious sense, or whether it's Rivals, to this being their first experience and not understanding the way the game mechanics are intended to work. And that's not their fault. There is a little bit of sitting on the front porch griping about the young people these days in this argument. I totally get that. But that's not really the intention here. This is more about developer intent versus intent of play versus designed play. And I don't, again, this is an off the cuff video, so I haven't put the notes in front of me for some of the things I've actually talked about before. But there is, actually, go back and watch my video on what's it called? Dead by Daylight for more on this particular issue if you're curious. There is the way game designers design their game to be played and expect it to be played, and a certain assumption of play patterns that will always happen, regardless of genre, regardless of whether it's multiplayer or single player. There's always an expected play, and then there's how people actually play, and that may be very in line, or it may be very different, but that can be influenced by the developers. It can be influenced by the developers' expectations and their assumptions about their player base, and their actual knowledge of their player base. But it can also be influenced by the way they design the games. And that can be in subtle ways in terms of the game itself inherently by design, sort of punishing and rewarding in subtle ways that lead you towards the state of play that is intended by the developers. And then there's other things like tutorials and those sorts of things that can also influence the same state of play ideas. But both of those things can be hard to do. The former is a lot harder than the latter, but the latter seems to be pretty hard as well, and I'm not really sure why. The number of games in recent memory that have had an actually good quality tutorial in them has been extremely small over the last 15 years. And the number of them that have actually encouraged you actively or required you to do their high quality tutorial is even smaller. And you'd think perhaps that that's not necessary, or that it's too much of a a railroading of a player or something like that. And while I can see that argument, I firmly disagree, especially when it comes to multiplayer games. Another digression I'm not going to really get into is the issues with League and how much of League's own toxicity and its reputation for toxicity over 15 years has been because of a neglectful developer that doesn't care to build their game to encourage and support positive play, and instead really throws everybody to the wolves. And that's true of not just League, but League is a big issue in that regard. And I think several other games I've played recently, including Rivals, have come to the same issue, which is Rivals actually has a kind of decent tutorial. It's okay. It's acceptable. It teaches you some basic functions that you need to know. It's not throwing you straight into the game with no knowledge whatsoever of its finer details. And that is a good step forward, but it's like still a 3 out of 10 in terms of doing a good job of establishing expected play. And I think that is in no small part because the developers are making a very wrong-headed assumption that people jumping into this game already understand what needs to be done. Man, this got far away from what my initial point was, but we'll get back to it at some point, I swear. And so even understanding what role-based games are about, I think the design of Rivals and many other games that I've already mentioned assumes a level of knowledge that is simply not there in many players. And that is not generally the fault of the players. That is the fault of the developers for not recognizing who their player base is likely to be, or what resources that player base needs, or how that player base is ever going to improve at their game and not get frustrated with it and not turn into a toxic cesspool. Because to be perfectly frank, the voice chat in Rivals is nasty, and I am shocked that it has voice chat, honestly, or at least that it's not locked below a certain level, because there are a lot of salty people out there, and some of them are salty for reasonable reasons, but they're overblowing their complaints, and some people are just salty because they're going to be salty and they think they're the greatest and everybody else is trash, which is absurd, of course. But this gets to the major failure of the developers and the issue with the player base. The player base doesn't largely seem to understand what their roles are supposed to be. So, returning back to my very original point, we're talking about a class-based system. In this case, it's very simplified. We're looking at 3 general classifications. We're looking at tank, DPS, and healer. And that has generally been the case for other hero shooters, MOBAs, a little bit less extent, and then more traditional. The closer you get to traditional RPGs, whether tabletop or video games, you get further and further away from that. But that also goes back chronologically. All of those things go back chronologically. And if you're a teenager right now, or you're maybe even in your early 20s, there's a decent chance you've never touched a lot of that older stuff. Maybe the only thing you touched before, maybe you've touched no games before this, or you've only touched Overwatch 2, or maybe, a handful of others that have come out. But with the decline of this historical knowledge, but developers who assume there's a level of knowledge there, or seem to by their design, what you end up with is a lot of players who don't play their roles and don't really seem to understand what the role is intended to be. So for a very quick, brief overview, maybe I'll throw this into a short or something if I remember to. In Rivals, you have tanks, DPS, and healers. The job of the tank is to pull aggro. It is to be on the point generally. It is to CC, that is crowd control enemy heroes, and to generally be defensive. You have a lot more health than all of your other characters. You're intended to sort of pull all the damage. The healer's job is to keep the tank alive, and first and foremost, and then to keep the DPS alive if they can. The DPS's job is to, first and foremost, and let me make this very, very clear, keep the healer alive. I'm going to repeat that. It's to keep the healer alive. Because if the healer's dead, everything else collapses. Now, the DPS tends to think, even more experienced players, and this goes back much longer, the DPS tends to think that their job is to do damage. It isn't. If their job, it is secondary for them to do damage, and they very much do need to do that to the enemy team. But they need to, in addition to the tank, who should be pulling aggro off the healer anytime they see it, the DPS needs to be pushing back against anyone who is trying to kill their healer. Because the reverse is true. You're playing two sides that are basically in equal position. The DPS's first offensive job is to kill the enemy healers, especially with the way the balance of power is in Rivals. This is very much a game about healing, even if it doesn't look like that, because there's a lot of healing going on and there's a lot of damage going on at the same time. And if the healer dies, everything else collapses. And that's because the tank needs to be alive. If the tank is not alive, everybody else has a lot less health, a lot less defensive ability, a lot less CC, and everybody else scatters to the wind and or dies. So, the tank needs to stay alive. The way the tank stays alive is partially by self-defense, but also primarily because the healer is keeping them alive at all times. The DPS's job is basically to surround the enemy's objective. Well, it depends on the objectives, but primarily to pick off the enemy healer so that the enemy tank dies, so that the enemy DPS can be aggroed more effectively, locked down, and removed from play as well. But if you just let if DPS just goes to fight other DPS, or they try and fight the tank directly and ignore the healer, or they let their own healer die, in which case the tank dies, in which case the whole thing falls apart, then it doesn't work. And that doesn't even get into the problem here of there's a variety of different game modes, or sort of ish, in Rivals, whether it's point defense or pushing the card, these sorts of things, all things that go back to, I mean, TF2 and even earlier, but TF2 is in many ways the genre setter for hero shooters. This is the rock, paper, scissors dynamic of this game, and it's been around for a long time. But the game doesn't teach that super well. Oh my God, we're already at 18 minutes. All right, I'm going to try and wrap this up in a reasonable amount of time. The game doesn't teach that super well. It doesn't teach these dynamics. It doesn't teach the rock, paper, scissors all that well. It's assuming that that is intuitive to people. And unfortunately, it just isn't. It might be learned by attrition, but it may not be particularly obvious for a great majority of players. I think this is really interesting both from a game design standpoint as well as sort of a historical, generational, learned experience standpoint. I think for gamers of a certain age, a lot of these things are fairly intuitive. And as long as you aren't also enticed by the inherent design that sort of encourages you not to play that way, because the movement and the maps and all these other things also lead you to certain avenues of play There's a lot of chasing that goes on, those sorts of things. People don't make good tactical choices about retreating and defending and attacking at appropriate times. That's all a lot more complicated. But even just getting down the basics of nobody's on the point, or nobody's on the cart, or the tank is way out front, or the healers just died the 7th time because nobody's looking after them, or, whatever else. That's all leading to bad experiences, not only for the older generation that does understand this, I think generally a little bit better. It also leads to a negative dynamic for all the new players who might be coming in, all the people who might be having their early experiences. And it's fundamentally not a good experience to feel like you're dying all the time, and that isn't what should be happening. Sometimes that's just a matter of teaching the good behaviors, right? The healer shouldn't be dying all the time because they should be defended. The DPS, meanwhile, should probably be getting some sort of feedback from the game that says, hey, it's okay that you die sometimes. You don't need to be the rock star all the time. There's a couple of you, probably, depends on the team comp. Team comps are a whole other thing in Rivals. It's wild. But depending on the team comp, you've probably got at least 2, maybe up to 4 DPS. And if you're, making tactically sound decisions, but you're, taking a dive and dying, but you pick off the healer or something like that, a DPS for a healer trade is a very good trade to be making. This is ultimately a little like chess, that sometimes it's the right thing to do. And you should not feel like it's a failure if you die. But at the same time, you should be looking around at your team. Look at what is happening to your healer and your tank and your other DPS, and what's happening on this part of the map and not that part of the map. And all of these go into tactical learning, tactical thought processes that are a lot more complex, and I think generally are a little harder to directly teach. So setting up early expectations, going back to the basics, whether it's all the way back to chess, or it's back to D&D style RPG stuff, or traditional isometric RPGs from the 90s, those sorts of things, to Overwatch, all these sorts of things. The same learning is ultimately still there, that you got to work as a team. And if nobody teaches you what that team is supposed to look like, and what everybody's roles are and expectations are, and that there's flexibility in that, but that there are tried and true reasons why the characters are designed the way they are, then everybody has a worse time. Anyway, I think that mostly covers my general rambling thoughts on this. Maybe this will turn into something else that I come back to later, a longer form video, but thank you guys for listening to me ramble and rant once again. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.